Hi everyone. So in this video we are going to be reviewing your submissions for assignment 4. So just to review, for assignment 4 we are looking for one image that has a large depth of field and one image that has a small depth of field. A large depth of field image is one where everything is in focus. So everything from the foreground to the background is in focus. An image with a small depth of field has one thing in focus and everything either in front of it or back of it or both is out of focus. So there's a couple ways you can do this from a logistical point of view. So first of all, the easiest way is working with your f-stop on the camera. For large depth of field images, we want to have f-stops that are somewhere around 16 or 22. And then for small depth of field images, we would want to have f-stop settings that are like 5.6, 4, 2.8, or 1.8. The second thing that we could do for these large and small depth of field images are use telephoto and wide angle lenses. So with a large depth of field shot, a wide angle lens just naturally, by the optical makeup of it, tends to have everything, or at least almost everything, in focus. So to get a large depth of field, you could use a wide angle lens, or you could use a wide angle lens with an f-stop of 22, which is really going to exaggerate that effect. And then conversely, with the small depth of field, telephoto lenses or zoom lenses that work through the telephoto range, those lenses will give us that very small depth of field in our images. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of your photos. So first of all, we have Kenny's images here, and he's got a large depth of field image and then our small depth of field image here. Let me just make that a little bit smaller so you can see the whole shot. And we've got a small depth of field image here. What I really love about this shot is the blue Blistex jar has this great writing on it, and our eyes naturally are attracted to written words in photographs anyways. So by having those written words and then by exaggerating the effect that it has on our perception of things in this photograph by using a small depth of field, our eye is really drawn to this thing. So I think, we pretty much all can agree, although, it's a pretty busy photograph in the background, our eyes almost immediately go to this because it is a small depth of field image. You can see that background is out of focus and the foreground here is definitely in focus. If we go to our file info here, we can see that you used an f-stop of 4.5, which is super ideal on that. You've got a focal length of 35 millimeters, which is very slightly wide angle, but I think the effect here is primarily being controlled by that f-stop, which is fantastic there. So small depth of field, great job on that. Your large depth of field image, it's got many elements that are in focus, so we can see the carpet here and the battery and the edge of the furniture and even this ceramic piece, I guess it is there. All of them are in focus to varying degrees, but I wouldn't say this is a good example of a large depth of field image because, we've got the foreground here really out of focus on the Blistex jar. And I think if we were to go into our file info here, we might find some reasons for that. And yeah, right away we see that for this image you have an f-stop of 5, which is very much a low f-stop value, which is going to almost always give us a small depth of field, not a large depth of field So on this one, was a little bit of a miss on that. Now, of course, we can go back to your settings here, and you're in a pretty tough situation. You know, your ISO's pushed really high, so that must mean that it's a pretty low light situation, and your exposure is at 1/15 of a second, which is probably, again, in a spot that you're going to have to use a tripod or something to stabilize your camera. So with all of that being said, what are your options here? Probably what I would have done is taken my exposure and gone to maybe a full 1 second or maybe even a 2 second exposure, which is going to allow that f-stop to go up to 11 or 16. And then I would have to put my camera on a tripod. So camera on a tripod, or even, camera on the floor or on a table, or something that's going to stabilize it so that it doesn't move when you take the photograph. Because unfortunately, there's just no way to hand hold a camera for 1 second or 2 seconds and still have everything sharp in the image. So with that being said, I like the images. I like what you're doing here. I think just a slight little technical error with the f-stop on the large depth of field image. But otherwise, a solid job on this. So next up, we have Brianna's images. And we've got her small depth of field image, and then the large depth of field image here. So let's take a look at this first. I think, first from just a compositional point of view, I really love what's going on here. We've got this nice, wonderful line that sort of draws our eye through the photograph from the lower left-hand corner all the way through the center of the frame, and it kind of ends up here on this light that's shining right above the Canisius banner. And I think that's interesting because a lot of times in images we tend to set them up so that they've got these great lines, but then the lines don't draw us anywhere. They kind of just go off into space or go off into infinity. So I really love the fact that your eye really does sort of take us through the frame here and allows us to land in a spot that's super interesting in the photograph. So I think it works from that perspective. From the large depth of field end of things, we want everything from the foreground to the background in focus, and certainly we can see these bricks are really sharp there. The flowers in the bed are sharp there, and even the clock and the banner and even that ugly tower in the background are all really sharp here. So that looks really good. Let's take a look at your information. Well, gosh, your f-stop is at 4.1, which to everybody, as we've talked about here, we want an f-stop that's higher, one that is 11, 16, 22, ideally. However, in this case, you're using a 7mm lens or 7.7mm lens, which is a super wide angle lens. So if you recall from the content and even what I just spoke about at the beginning of this video, when we use really wide angle lenses, those are another way to achieve a large depth of field. So the reason you got large depth of field in this image was because you were using a wide angle lens, not because of your f-stop. Ideally, I'd love to see that f-stop setting somewhere in the higher numerical range. Now for your small depth of field, so you had talked about in your written statement that you were particularly attracted or drawn to the clouds in this photograph. And so in the small depth of field image, you've given us an exposure that's a whole bunch darker, probably twice as dark as the previous image. So when we have a darker exposure, that certainly is going to bring out the details in areas that are brighter. So certainly from that perspective, I think the sky is absolutely very dramatic here and very aesthetically appealing. However, I'm concerned that this really is not a small depth of field image. The spot here in the foreground, it's darker, but it's not any less out of focus than those previous images. In fact, it almost looks like it's perhaps just a little bit more in focus, just a little bit darker. So I'm wondering what's going to come up when we see our settings here. And yeah, you're using the same lens. You just change the exposure through the shutter, which you made the wrong choice there. You needed to change the exposure in the aperture, and we would have ideally liked to do that in aperture priority, not shutter priority, because aperture priority is really designed for controlling this depth of field in the image here. So f-stop, we'd like to see that go a little bit lower. Perhaps, I'm not necessarily sure if it can go lower on your camera. But the other thing here that really is messing you up is the wide angle lens. So you've still got the wide angle lens on there. So what you would need to do for this image essentially is you need to go back farther. You have to step away. So if you were shooting this kind of from those stairs that were along the pathway, you might have to step or walk all the way back to Dugan Hall and then zoom in. So you're essentially going to get the same perspective or same vantage point, but you're going to be doing it without a wide angle lens. You're going to be doing it with a telephoto lens, and that's going to give us the small depth of field. So excuse me, again, a little bit of a technical miss here, and that is definitely related to the fact that you're using a wide angle lens here. So all of these things, you kind of got to play around with them, experiment with them, and work them out, because it's always going to be combinations of f-stop and lens focal length that is going to give you those ideal large depth of fields and small depth of field examples here. So keep an eye on that, especially maybe when you are trying to work with depth of field, rather than working with shutter priority, I might opt for working with aperture priority on my camera. So give it a try and let me know how that goes. So next up we have Zoe's images, and we've got our small depth of field shot and then our large depth of field shot. So small depth of field shot, first of all, I love the image itself. I love this sort of warm ambient light that is coming off of this lighting unit or this lamp or whatever the heck that is. And I think what's really interesting about it is the yellow really, or the warm yellow amber tone to it, really plays nicely with the blues in the background of kind of like that dark low light situation in the rainy outdoors that are happening in the background. So from a content perspective, I think this image itself is really, really super interesting. Love it a lot. And I think the other little detail on here that's super wonderful is these raindrops that are on the window there. I think having those also add a little bit of atmospheric element and kind of, again, play off of that the dreary outdoors versus sort of this really warm, comfortable, I guess we call it homey interiors that you're shooting from. So love it a lot. Looks like it's a small depth of field image here. This building in the background outside is out of focus. We'll look at your settings here. ISO of 3.5. Yeah, that's perfect. Gosh, I again want to emphasize with small depth of field, we want to stay away from wide angle lenses or the wide angle part of your zoom. And here you're at 18 millimeters, which definitely is wide angle. But we can see how that having that f-stop of 3.5 is really canceling that out here. So I think that works pretty fine. For this one, large depth of field, certainly that building in the background is sharper than it was in this image. So I can see where you're going, but again, we're going to go into your file info, and you're using an f-stop of 5.6, and gosh, we'd love to have that number again up somewhere around f11, f16, f22. And I know you're kind of pushing the limits here with low light and the ISO. So again, another good reason to use a tripod on your photos so that you can stabilize things. So you can kind of sort of push those extremes, especially in the aperture or f-stop zone. So this is pretty close. I don't think it's a perfect example, but I think it's a better example of large depth of field. So certainly I get where you're going with this, and I think you get the idea of it, but there's probably a couple of technical choices here that you could have changed that I think would have even emphasized that large depth of field even more. But nevertheless, really, really solid two images from an aesthetic perspective that I think I really like here. So good job with that. So next up we have Adalberto's images, and we've got his small depth of field image, and then large depth of field image. And this, I think, is a really, really good example of what I'm looking for here. So small depth of field, the bag is in focus, all of the details in the background are out of focus there. Really love the way you've composed this image. Again, we've kind of got these little diagonal lines that lead our eye into the photograph. We've got the logo and the textural pattern of the bag that's in focus. That certainly is very visually compelling and interesting. And if we go into our file info, we see that you are at an f-stop of 5.0, which is exactly what I was looking for. And then your large depth of field, notice everybody the difference here. How everything's in focus in the background here, in the foreground, in the bag. That's our large. This is our small. So this is a perfect example of what we're going for there. Let's see what adjustments you made to get that in there. Bingo. F-stop 11. Exactly what we're looking for. I might have even pushed this ISO to 200 and put this f-stop to 16. But pretty good example, and pretty much exactly what I am looking for out of this assignment. So one thing you did mention in your written statement, you were having trouble focusing on either the bag or the background. It wouldn't focus on both. Just to clarify here, your camera is not, the actual autofocus itself is not going to focus on the background or the foreground at the same time. It's going to pick one or the other. What's really happening here as we move that f-stop higher up in the numerical value, what's happening is the optics of the lens are actually changing, and that's where we get the effect of the large depth of field. And it's not an effect that you see when you're looking through the camera, because when you're looking through your camera, you are not seeing a real world preview of actually what's going on. You're seeing the camera set up at its optimal viewing. So hopefully that kind of explains why what you're seeing in the camera, what you're trying to focus on, the background and foreground, is not happening. That's one of the reasons we do this large depth of field experiment, because it's not really something that you can see while you're focusing. It's something that happens after we take the picture, because when you take a photograph, that's when that aperture setting comes in and engages. Now we do have a button on the camera called the depth of field preview button that can kind of give you an idea of what the picture is going to look like. But it's kind of tough to use, because when you engage it, it makes the viewfinder a lot darker too. So that's one of the reasons I really don't talk about that too much. I think it's just kind of easier to take the photograph and then look at it once the exposure has been made as the JPEG that's created. So hopefully that helps there with the answer to that question and the troubles you were having with that. But nevertheless, home run on this photo here. Great job, and really exactly what I was looking for. So great work on this one. So next up, I have Paul or PJ's images here. So Paul, I've mentioned it in our last video, and we've mentioned this a couple times, and it's been in the assignment notes. I don't want you to embed the images in a Word or a PDF document because we can't look at the file info that is in or that is available to us in Photoshop. The best I can do is kind of zoom in like this, and even zooming in like this, like honestly, is really not super helpful to me because I can't pixel peep, as they say, really looking at what's going on. So please, 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 in the future, I need you to submit your images separately from the PDF document that has your statements in it. So that being said, a perfect example of a large depth of field here, and your f-stop setting for your large depth of field image, I'm assuming, is not this, because this would seem to me would give us, with the especially f-stop of 1.8, and a 28 millimeter lens typically is not a 1.8 lens. So I don't think that's the settings for this image. Although again, this image is a great large depth of field. You know, we've got the grate and the bricks all the way back to the chapel are in focus. Your second image here is your small depth of field. I think this is a great example of a small depth of field. We've got the book here with the IHS logo on it is in sharp focus, and we can see the trees and some of the other elements in the background here are out of focus. And you know, the specs here would seem to me to correspond to this photograph. If if somebody told me this is what the settings that they were using, that's kind of the look and feel I would suspect that you'd get out of that. So anyhow, that I think is good on both of those. But again, I would really love for you to submit those images as JPEG so I could look at those things in there just a little bit more thoroughly. You know, it's also interesting to read through your reflections here. You talk about the shutter setting also made the large depth of field photo brighter because it was much faster and captured more light than the small depth of field. So the shutter setting, if it's faster, it's actually going to be darker, and the shutter setting is really not the factor that is contributing to depth of field. It's your aperture and your lens length. So I feel like you're a little bit confused on that end of things. So, work through this, and if you have any questions, shoot me an email, and certainly be willing to talk about this a little bit more with you and help you work through it. But again, the appearance of your images looks great. You've got a large depth of field and a small depth of field. I'm just wondering if you really kind of understand how those settings that you're actually using are contributing to that. That is the big question that I have here. So again, just a reminder, please put your images as JPEGs rather than as embedded in PDF or Word documents. Thanks. And then last but not least, we have Alexis's images, and here we've got our small depth of field, and here we've got our large depth of field. You'll notice that she's zoomed in very tight, so telephoto, and zoomed out very wide here, so wide angle. So just without even looking at our f-stop settings, just through the use of lens here, or through backing up and getting closer, the physical distance between the subject, you've already managed to get that small and large depth of field effect. So I like that a lot. The one thing here, Alexis, that I might say you could try refining is the area that you've gotten really sharp focus is actually this leaf right here, which is good in the sense that you've demonstrated the technique to me, and it really works for me. But I got to be honest with you, I think the most interesting part about the photo are these two petunia leaves. And I actually would rather have the petunia leaf in sharp focus rather than or the petunia petal rather than the leaf on the stem here. So that's just a matter of focusing in on this rather than putting your focus dot here. Or actually, I suspect your focus dot might have been right here because that's in sharp focus too. But nevertheless, you really have our small depth of field effect going on here. Now, it's really interesting when we go in and look at your settings here. You're at 18 millimeters, which is wide angle, and you're at an f-stop of 4. So the wide angle is not ideal, but that f-stop is definitely ideal for the small depth of field. And then, it looks like you just physically got very close to these flowers. So, again, we can either use lenses, physical distance, or f-stop aperture to come up with that small depth of field effect here. And in this case, it probably is your small depth of field is being created by the low f-stop number. And then your large f-stop here, you're clearly moved far away from the subject, so that's one thing. And then if we go to our file info, you're at an f-stop of 9, which is good. Not perfect, but it's good. In this case, I probably would have moved my ISO up to 200 or 400. That way I could have gone to like an f-stop of 11 or even 16. But nevertheless, we can see that our flowers, our hanging baskets are in sharp focus, the railings in sharp focus, and then all the way back to the shed and the picnic table in the background are all in sharp focus. So great job on both of these. Again, the one thing that maybe I would change is just making sure that, the thing that is in focus here is the thing that's the most interesting in the image. But nevertheless, I definitely got the gist of what we're looking for in this assignment, and I think you've pretty much mastered that technique. So good job on this, Alexis. So that is going to wrap us on this series of feedbacks. A couple more coming up for you guys, and certainly we'll have one big one that talks about your rough draft images for your final project coming up. So lots of videos to watch this week. Not a lot of written content to go over, but you're going to see that we definitely have a bunch of videos that it's really important for you to make sure that you watch. So please do that.